afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, my very, very humble thanks from the bottom of my heart for having us here. I represent the National Indian Students Union UK. And I'd like to thank the Honourable High Commissioner Dr. Ranjan Mithai for taking the time and effort to finally engage the Indian student population in this country. So thank you very much for that. For those of you who don't know NISU, NISU is a body that represents Indian students, both international from India as well as homegrown in this country. And we work with Indian societies at universities all across the nation, from Scotland through to Wales as well as England. What I've done today is I've segregated the term Indian diaspora. For ease of analysis, I'll break it down into two groups: a non-resident Indian, which I refer to as persons born and brought up in India who are studying or working in the UK, and the British Indian, or the persons of Indian origin who are actually born and brought up outside of India and are living or working in the UK. So people both of countries such as Kenya, Uganda, other African countries, etc. So I'm going to categorize two issues today. Firstly, the one that affects NRIs in the country, the Indian student population in the country. Students, I believe, and so do my colleagues at NISU, students have been looked at as a burden so far, rather than as an opportunity. The fact is that students benefit the UK. International students, this is a very well documented and discussed fact actually, they're of tremendous importance, both economically as well as otherwise. Various reports put the figure of contribution from international students to around £8 billion in direct and indirect revenue to the UK. It's actually the fourth largest export market for the UK. As well as that, they bring a lot of cultural richness to British campuses that wouldn't otherwise be there, and they go back as friends of the UK according to the British Council, and rightly so, promoting Indo-UK trade ties in the future. Now, yet, despite all of that, there's a 25% decline in the number of Indian students into the UK. And they constantly tell us that they feel unwelcome, they feel that they're a burden, and they feel as though they're prisoners in the UK. Because when they go to university, they need to get attendance checked at every session, so on and so forth. However, when David Cameron, our respected PM, goes to UK twice in 1 year, he tells us that one of the very first things he says is that Indian students, there's no limit to the number of Indian students that can come to the UK, and that you're very welcome. At the same time, Dr. Vince Cable last week actually reiterated the fact that there's no limit, but that there are ugly noises around Indian students in the UK. These ugly noises I want to touch upon. They're very real, and they're troubles that Indian students face every day, and we hear of them daily on a regular basis. Three issues around that: the removal of the post-study work visa, which I'm sure you've all heard of, mid-cycle changes, and close down of bogus colleges. The first one, removal of the post-study work visa. Needless to say, international education is a significant investment. What happens is, when you want to go abroad, you're not just looking at the quality of the educational establishment that you're going to, or the reputation. That used to be the case, and that is where Britain has a sole competitive advantage. Now people are looking at two other things, rightfully. Aggregate cost of living and studying. Undeniably, the pound is a very, very strong currency, particularly when the rupee fluctuates so much. And finally, and most crucially, access to post-study training opportunities and working opportunities. We find that there are three perspectives in this whole situation. There's the perspective of the Indian student. All they want is excellent education, access to globally recognized training and employment opportunities, and crucially, they want to return to India in the long run. We recognize that wasn't the case perhaps 10 years ago, but now they all tell us, and the British Council has in fact documented this, only 3% Indian students from India actually want to settle abroad in the long run. The rest want to return to India. And particularly, as my honourable colleague mentioned earlier on, India has been modified pretty recently. Everyone wants to have one leg in India now, and the students are not any different to that. So the actual issue in question is that Indian students want those three things I've mentioned there. What does the UK want? The UK wants to benefit from the economic and non-monetary advantages that Indian students bring. They also want to maintain their migration targets, and rightfully so. And finally, they want that Indian students should not be a drain on the UK taxpayer. Thirdly, India wants to reduce brain drain. It's a significant problem from India, as many of its best and brightest students actually go abroad and sometimes don't return and settle abroad because of lack of good enough opportunities in their home country. In line with the vision of supplying skilled labor to the world in future that Modi ji has, his global vision is that India will supply skilled labor in the future, What is it that we can do looking at all those three perspectives that actually culminate in a positive solution? So, we were invited to deliver an address at Westminster Legal Policy Forum last year, where we presented this solution, and in fact it was taken on board, thankfully, by the British government in a modified version, which is now known as a Tier 5 intern visa. So we're very thankful for that. But now it's my humble request to both Indian stakeholders as well as British stakeholders to consider this solution that we think might address this issue in some shape or form. So, Indian and UK government must collaborate on this issue. The UK should develop N-year, 2-year employment or internship scheme, which is conditional on return to India. So a student cannot obtain this visa unless they sign a document that they will return to India. They're legally bound by that. The holders are not able to switch to any other settlement category. The route does not lead to settlement. And finally, of course, there's no recourse to public funds. India should create specific schemes to encourage these returning professionals into public sector jobs to maximize their impact in India, and into schemes that can actually train. They should use this British education and training, which is world-class undoubtedly, and train Indian youth, because if you're going to have to educate 500 million young people in the country, you're going to need your own people to be able to do that for you, who have that education. Once employed in the public and also in the private sectors, these highly educated workers will drive India's development as well as trade with the UK. So that's one solution we have to how the two governments can work together, and it's my request to the Honourable Joint Secretary here to take that on board. Coming back to what I was mentioning about sort of these ugly noises that Dr. Cable spoke of, there's mid-cycle changes in bogus colleges. These are issues we hear of at all times. I think Indian diaspora consists of NRIs, but what we haven't heard so far is anyone discussing the issues these students face when there are mid-cycle changes. So they come in on one perspective, and suddenly rules change. Suddenly they can't do X, they can't do Y, they can't do Z. So what promises they were made when these universities went out and recruited them are completely washed away. And they're left with no recourse. They don't know where to go, they don't know who to speak to, unless they're very rich and can afford private lawyers, there's not much they can do. So they cause real anxiety. The students will come in on one basis, find themselves in another position. So my question is to all of you here, and to my esteemed panelists, whose responsibility is the welfare of these students that find themselves in this situation? Is it going to be the Indian government, whose citizens these students are? Is it going to be the British government, who's made promises and recruited these students here? Is it the UKBA? Who is it? We don't have an answer, clear answer to that yet. So that's a question I have. Secondly, there's the issue of students trapped in a vicious cycle of bogus colleges. There's all this rhetoric around bogus colleges and bogus students. I'd like to reiterate the fact that there is no such thing as a bogus student. Wherever there's a law, people break it. And that's a fact of life. So there's no such thing as a bogus student. However, when there are colleges which are getting highly trusted sponsor status and then getting shut in a few weeks, I don't think that's a student's fault. That's an institutional mistake that needs to be corrected, and I'm very happy that these bogus colleges are now being shut. But what happens when there's hundreds of bogus colleges which are shut? What happens to these students? They've come in and they're completely lost in the system. What then happens is they're given 60 days by the UKBA to find another college. Needless to say, the probability of them finding a college which is not bogus in 60 days, so 2 months, is very low. They get trapped again. Students have gone to the extent of telling me and my committee that they're suicidal. मैं suicide कर लूँगी, मैं मर जाऊँगी, मैं वापस नहीं जा सकती, मैं किस तरह वापस जाऊँ? There's social stigma back there. So these are things that we must consider again. Whose responsibility is it? Where do these students go? There was a case earlier on, Cattle versus Secretary of State a couple of years ago. 2,000 students, international students, were caught in that issue. It was a legal battle. Where do they get money from? They're already funding their education by underwriting. They're actually taking on loans, lifetime worth of savings, assets are being sold. The UK is a very expensive place to live and study in. So again, my question is, whose responsibility is it for the welfare of these students? So they're going through emotional distress, financial loss, and loss of years of academic life, switching from one college to another, whose responsibility is to take care of them? It's an unnecessary and an unfair hassle on them. I'll also take on board a very recent issue. July and sort of August 2014, there was a recent immigration crackdown and a subsequent Quality Assurance Agency review negatively affected hundreds of students. I'll One student whose words really sort of caught me by a lot of disappointment is right here. There's many of them. So the university, I'll set a stone background actually. So University of Sunderland, its London campus was put under a QA review, and as an anticipatory move, it decided to withdraw all offers that were made for 2014. These are the words of one of the students who was told a couple of weeks before he was meant to come to the UK what happened to him. I'm really disappointed. I left a prestigious job at Tata Consultancy Services, a very prestigious firm in India, to pursue MBA Finance at the University of Sunderland's London campus starting August 2014. After receiving my visa and fulfilling necessary requirements, I'm told in July by the university that they're withdrawing offers for 2014 due to them being put through a fraud college review. I have a 7.5 IELTS score and can communicate perfectly well in English. This shocking news has come my way a mere few weeks before I'm due to start an entirely new life in the UK, something I've been planning for years. Why am I being harassed and put through this? Why is there no support from the university, the British Council, the UK government, or the Indian government? Who am I supposed to speak to? I can't continue studies now. I can't return to my job for another year due to company policies, and I've taken out a loan to fund my studies that I can't repay early, i.e. it's paying interest. Please help me. This is one of hundreds of people who contact us who are in similar situations. So my question is, who will look after their welfare? There needs to be someone who can protect them, represent them, because they are people at the end of the day, and they're members of our diaspora. So it is our responsibility to take care of them. I don't personally need, I'm not an international student. I don't need a visa to study here. But when I hear of such stories, it's the biggest initiative NISU has got on board right now, because there are people and we need to take care of them. So, well, what's the solution? Well, NISU didn't exist. We brought it up. We founded NISU a couple of years ago. We are representing Indian students in the UK and all their concerns. But in order to do so most efficiently and effectively, we require your support. Every single one of you in this room, we require your support. We require support from the Indian government and from the British government. The Indian government in particular, whose citizens we wish to support and represent outside of India. I'm going to skip over the question about working professionals because of time limits, and I'll pick it up later. The second issue I wanted to touch on is within the UK's Indian community. What we found in the young diaspora group is that there's a significant gap between how these two groups that I mentioned earlier, the non-resident Indians and the British Indians, actually interact, and how their engagement with India takes place. The engagement of British Indians tends to majorly take place on a religious and a cultural level. So they're either Hindus or Sikhs or Muslims first, or Punjabis and Gujaratis before India. The engagement of non-resident Indians, on the other hand, is a nationalist engagement. They're Indian first. Most of the students who come here anyway, they tend to be from cities, and that's how they're born and brought up. They're Indians first. The issue is that we can lose out on significant talent and connect with both these groups if their respective needs aren't addressed. So what we need to do, British Indians need to be provided opportunities to engage with modern, contemporary India and its future. And I was very pleased to hear yesterday that Baroness Prashar has actually been working on re-engagement with India, Reimagine India. So many thanks to her for that. We'd like to work with her on that. Secondly, Indian citizens should be able to vote in Indian elections without the barrier of a physical presence in that country. Technology, if India can supply IT to the world, why can't we sort our own IT out? That's the second issue. And finally, the Indian government should support initiatives that aim to bridge the knowledge and communication gap between NRIs and British Indians in order to create a strong, unified diaspora. In conclusion, all the points I've listed, please support Indian students in the UK and ensure they aren't unfairly victimized. Please develop a two-way visa scheme for selected Indian students, incentivizing and making compulsory their return to India and public sector jobs. And please support Indians wishing to bring their family or parents over to the UK by making the visa process as simplified as possible for those that don't need recourse to public funds. Please engage more frequently and in more ways with the Indian diaspora spread throughout the UK, not just key hubs such as London and Birmingham, but also places like Aberdeen, Glasgow. Huge Indian communities are present there. And finally, please provide opportunities for young British Indians to gain an understanding of contemporary India and to positively increase their engagement with their motherland. Programs like No India, No Goa, they need to be advertised. They exist, I know, but they're not advertised properly right now. Please understand the dynamics of the NRI-British Indian relationship to devise effective and efficient policies. And finally, please support and develop initiatives to bridge the gap between NRIs and British Indians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanam. That was it young, was refreshing, and you've thrown up challenges both to the Government of India and to Great Britain. I know that my dear friend and colleague, the Sharma Member of Parliament, Feeling Southall, is regularly troubled by this and regularly raises this matter in Parliament, and I'm sure he'll make a contribution later on the subject. But this is not a message which goes unheard. We are aware of it, and we want to address it. Our next speaker is Mr. T.K. Manoj Kumar, the Joint Secretary at the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. He's going to make a contribution.